The Irish. The Irish became an ethnic minority in England and the United States through immigration, as a minority in part of their own country through the settlement of Englishmen and Scots in Ulster County. A long history of disunited, warring factions among the Irish made Ireland easy to invade and difficult to conquer. There was no central power whose defeat would signal the capitulation of the nation. Rather, the British invasion of 1169 marked only the beginning of centuries of skirmishes and battles over shifting boundaries between British-held territory and lands under the control of various Irish forces. As late as the 15th century, the British controlled only some walled towns and a coastal strip around Dublin. Eventually, however, the British prevailed throughout Ireland, though bloody uprisings occurred sporadically and were mercilessly crushed. Vast grants of lands and power to individual Britons in Ireland made the Irish not only subjugated to England and its laws and interests, but also at the mercy of the caprice of local powers, under no real constraint from laws. In Arthur Young's celebrated travels through Ireland in the 18th century, he noted that a landlord would punish disrespect or even sauciness with his cane or his horsewhip, and the Irish recipient of this punishment could have his bones broken if he offered to lift his hand in his own defense. Some landlords had their own private prisons for punishing Irish workers, and though this practice was illegal, indictments against landlords who did this invariably failed to be sustained by grand juries. Young also noted, "It must strike the most careless traveler to see whole strings of cars whipped into a ditch by a gentleman's footman to make way for his carriage. If they are overturned or broken in pieces, no matter. It is taken in patience. Were they to complain, they would perhaps be horsewhipped." The period of the greatest oppressions in Ireland dated from Cromwell's punitive expedition in 1649 to avenge Protestants slaughtered in a Catholic uprising in 1641. The warfare itself and the famine and disease accompanying it killed more than 500,000 people, about 40% of the total population of Ireland at that time. Cromwell was merciless, not only in battle, but also in wholesale slaughter of surrendered soldiers and Irish Catholic civilians, including priests who were his especial quarry. Moreover, he had orphans, paupers, and others shipped off to the West Indies as hands, servants, or for whatever other uses the owners saw fit or unfit, altogether some 6,000 of these poor derelicts. Many Irish landowners were dispossessed of their best land, which was turned over to English and Scottish Protestant settlers. Cromwell herded many of the Irish gentry to the province of Connaught on pain of death, with the blunt ultimatum, "To hell or Connaught." In 1641, the indigenous Irish Catholics held an estimated 3/5 of the land in Ireland, but by 1665, this was down to 1/5, mostly in Connaught. By 1790, Irish Catholics owned only 14% of the land in their own country. After Cromwell's victory came the so-called penal laws, designed to stamp out the Catholic religion and prevent the indigenous Irish from rising economically or politically. The activities of the Catholic Church were severely limited, just short of outright banning, and Catholics were legally liable to pay tithes for the support of the established Protestant Church. Only Protestant education was permitted, and sending children abroad to be educated required a special license, without which severe penalties were imposed. A Catholic could neither vote nor hold political office, nor a military commission. He could not purchase an estate, and was prohibited from displaying luxuries considered inappropriate to his status by Protestants. He could not, for example, own a horse worth more than £5 sterling. He could not legally marry a Protestant, though there was little likelihood of that in any case. Not all these and other minute laws and regulations were carried out to the fullest in practice. Nor were they all part of a coherent plan. Rather, they emerged ad hoc, piecemeal, and often with no visible connection or consistency with one another. Their only guiding principle was keeping Catholics down and trying to force them to convert to Protestantism. But while not all the laws were executed to the fullest, other oppressions were freely used against the Irish without any legal sanction. As in other parts of the world, Extremism in Ireland led to counter-extremism. The Irish masses developed underground terrorist groups, the best known of which in the 18th century were the Levellers, or White Boys, so named because of the white shirts they wore to locate each other in nocturnal meetings. According to Arthur Young's contemporary description, it was a common practice with them to go in parties about the country, swearing many to be true to them, and forcing them by menaces which they often carried into execution. At last they set up to be general redressers of grievances, punished all obnoxious persons, and having taken the administration of justice into their own hands, were not very exact in the distribution of it. Forced masters to release their apprentices, carried off the daughters of rich farmers, ravished them into marriages. They levied sums of money on the middling and lower farmers in order to support their cause, and many of them subsisted for some years without work, supported by these contributions. The barbarities they committed were shocking. One of their usual punishments, and by no means the most severe, was taking people out of their beds, carrying them naked in winter, on horseback for some distance, and burying them up to their chin in a hole filled with briars, not forgetting to cut off one of their ears. Efforts to catch and convict the White Boys proved futile for many years, both because of their support among the Irish masses and because anyone who testified against them was marked for death. Extraordinary protection was given to those few witnesses who came forth, and after trial they had to choose exile or the risk of death. Eventually, however, the movement was suppressed and many of its leaders hanged. Another Irish movement, wholly nonviolent, proved more successful. As the penal laws were relaxed enough to permit some political activity, Daniel O'Connell organized the Irish to press for their complete repeal. This finally happened in 1829, an historic event known as the Catholic Emancipation. Economically, the Irish remained very poor, however. Writing in the 1830s, Gustave de Beaumont said, "I have seen the Indian in his forests, and the Negro in his chains, and thought, as I contemplated their pitiable condition, that I saw the very extreme of human wretchedness. But I did not then know the condition of unfortunate Ireland." This was not mere exaggeration for effect. The average slave in the United States had a life expectancy of 36 years, the average Irish peasant 19. The Irish peasants ate mostly potatoes, and occasionally fish, and many families never saw meat from one year to the next. Slaves in the United States ate a wide variety of coarse foods, including low grades of meat and poultry. The Irish lived in mud huts with thatched roofs, and usually no ventilation except the doorway. Slaves lived in log cabins with windows. In the United States, slaves built roaring wood fires in their cabins, but in deforested Ireland, the Irish poor burned turfs from the bogs. It was considered an unusually cruel slave owner who did not provide mattresses for slaves, but beds were rare among the Irish poor who slept in piles of straw. When the slaves were freed, they were destitute by American standards, but not as poor as the Irish peasants, according to W.E.B. Du Bois. In short, Irish poverty was unique, and neither the model nor the imitation can be found anywhere else. The Irish peasant wore rags handed down from generation to generation. Often this clothing was not new, even when originally purchased, for there was a flourishing market in second-hand clothing, much of which was imported in bulk from the cast-off clothing dealers in London. According to a contemporary account, the more fortunate of the Irish eat potatoes 3 times a day, others less fortunate twice, those in a state of indigence only once. There are some still more destitute who remain 1 or even 2 days without the slightest nourishment. Moreover, it was a poverty in stark contrast with the wealth of foreign landowners, with virtually no middle class in between. The low standards of living in Ireland in the 1830s were merely a prelude to the catastrophes of the 1840s, when the potato blight spread across the country, destroying the principal food of the poor and creating a massive famine. About 1 million people died of starvation and diseases related to it, and closer to 2 million emigrated from the mid-1840s to the mid-1850s. Ireland was one of the rare examples of a country declining in population for generations. The historic injustices done to the Irish by the British, some condemned even by such a British patriot as Winston Churchill, cannot automatically be assumed to be the reason for Irish poverty without confusing morality with causation. Ireland was poor and fragmented before the British arrived, and long after achieving independence has remained one of the poorer nations of Western Europe. Moreover, the Irish as a people have languished in poverty for generations after immigrating to other countries, even when, as in the United States, they ultimately advanced to prosperity. The soil and climate of Ireland would not explain its poverty. A higher proportion of the land of Ireland than of England was cultivated, and was of greater natural fertility. A group of German farmers who settled in Ireland in the 17th century were, by the 18th century, better fed, clothed, and housed than the Irish peasants. These German farmers were, by contemporary accounts, industrious, and remarkable for the goodness and cleanliness of their houses. In all these respects, they differed from the indigenous Irish. Arthur Young's travels through 18th century Dublin convinced him that the Irish there had no idea of English cleanliness, either in apartments, person, or cookery. In Ireland, in England, and in the United States, the Irish kept pigs, chickens, and other creatures living in their homes, even in urban communities. The 18th century Irish were described as lazy at work, but spiritedly active at play. Initiative was undermined by laws which made a tenant's improvements the property of the landlord, who could then raise the rent because the property was more valuable. Neither education nor entrepreneurship was part of the Irish tradition. Pre-invasion Gaelic society was hostile to literacy, and medieval Ireland was the only nation in Europe that did not build a single university during the Middle Ages. Self-reliance was also lacking. The Irishman was habituated to working for others, not striking out on his own. The Irish had little feel for trade and commerce, and seldom chose such careers for themselves or their children. Alcohol and alcoholism added to the problems of the Irish for centuries, both in Ireland and overseas. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Alcohol and alcoholism added to the problems of the Irish for centuries, both in Ireland and overseas. Widespread drunkenness was noted by travelers in 16th century Ireland, and as late as 1970, the percentage of personal income spent on alcohol in Ireland was the highest of any country in Europe. In the United States during World War II, the percentage of men rejected for military service for chronic alcoholism was higher among the Irish than among Negroes, Italians, or Jews. Similar patterns existed in World War I. Contemporary studies of Irish Americans show that they drink more and more frequently than any other ethnic group in the United States. Fighting was another feature of life in Ireland that was to mark the Irish wherever they went. The Fighting Irish was a cliché long before it was adopted by American sports reporters as a nickname for Notre Dame athletic teams. Irish fighting was the impulsive brawl rather than the implacable vendetta of the Italians. This fighting could range from man-to-man combat to the mass melee known as a Donnybrook, named for a town in Ireland. While the Irish had these various social handicaps, they also developed many skills and traits that would ultimately work to their advantage, at home and abroad. Over the centuries, they slowly abandoned Gaelic, their native tongue, for English, giving them advantages over other immigrants to the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. They developed a variety of grassroots organizations to cope with their disadvantages and oppressions under the penal laws in Ireland, and these provided both group cohesion and organizing skills that would later pay off in many ways, from the struggle for the independence of Ireland to Irish-run political machines that dominated American cities for generations. The verbal facility and human touch of the Irish was a key ingredient in their success in politics as well as in the clergy, writing, and the law. The Irish fascination with words has a long history. There was a constant jibing and joshing among themselves, and a genius for the apt nickname. They filled their language with poetic images and metaphors. The Irish developed the moral standards of a people tyrannized by an alien power, regarding the established institutions as illegitimate, evasion as a shield, and open defiance as suicidal. They were constantly tipping their hats to their overlords and lowered their eyes in the presence of the gentry, but at other times overcompensated with boasting and bluster. A 19th century observer described the Irishman as full of insolence when he is not cringing. Begging from private individuals and acceptance of public charity were long-standing patterns among the 19th century Irish, in their often desperate struggles for survival. Often families went begging through the countrysides, or the women and children might go when the man was too proud. Later generations of the Irish in Britain and America would also become wards of public charity. Many of those who left Ireland in the 19th century fit the description of Irish immigrants given by a Canadian writer. Men have come here who were unable to spell, who never knew what it was to have a shoe to their foot in Ireland. Whatever the characteristics of the Irish that formed over the centuries in Ireland, the massive migrations that started with the great famines of the 1840s took them to very different lands and new influences. By 1891, nearly 40% of all people born in Ireland lived outside Ireland. Some went to other parts of Great Britain, but of those who left the British Isles in the century after 1825, 90% went to the United States. Ireland was one of the few countries in the world with sustained declines in population for decades. In 1841, there were more than 8 million people in Ireland. By 1926, just over 4 million. Even today, there are not as many people living in Ireland as in the 1840s. There are more people of Irish ancestry in the United States than in Ireland. Britain. Nearby Britain was one of the first destinations of Irish emigrants. As early as 1243 A.D., there was a law in Britain used to expel Irish beggars. By the time of the Great Famine of the 1840s, there was a long history of Irish emigration to Britain, which absorbed half of the 1 million Irish immigrants fleeing the famine. In 1 year, 20,000 landed at Manchester, 50,000 at Glasgow, 250,000 at London, and 300,000 at Liverpool. Even today, many of the districts in which they settled are still identifiably Irish. The Irish immigrants generally lived in the decaying districts of the towns and cities, and a contemporary described them as crowded together with their native habits of filth and indolence. Nor can these accounts all be dismissed as biased. For the 19th century Irish immigrants in Britain were seen in very similar terms by writers ranging from the British conservative Thomas Carlyle to a young German radical in Manchester named Friedrich Engels. According to Carlyle, the Irishman in His Rags and Laughing Savagery performed all work that can be done by mere strength of hand and back for wages that will purchase him potatoes. Engels likewise characterized the Irish immigrant as having a crudity that places him little above the savage. The Irishman, according to Engels, deposits all garbage and filth before his house door here, as he was accustomed to do at home, and so accumulates the pools and dirt heaps which disfigure the working people's quarters and poison the air. Drunkenness was his hallmark, and while he could perform all simple, less exact work, for any work which requires long training or regular pertinacious application, the dissolute, unsteady, drunken Irishman is on too low a plane. In Britain, as in the United States, the rural Irish became city dwellers, undergoing a major social transformation rather than simply making a journey. Most lived in the largest and fastest-growing urban industrial communities. During the era of the famine, the poorest immigrants went to Britain rather than cross the Atlantic because of travel cost differences. Families with young children were also more likely to go to Britain rather than subject the children to the long, taxing voyage to the United States. Cost affected where the Irish settled in Britain. From their respective places of origin, they usually left by the nearest port in Ireland for the nearest major port in Britain. The Irish in London lived mostly in side streets and back alleys, close to the English, in enclaves located within English working-class neighborhoods, but neither geographic nor social assimilation took place. Entering some of the Irish enclaves required thick boots and a strong stomach. They were crowded with pigs, dogs, and fowl, and strewn with discarded fish and other refuse interspersed with little pools of undrained water. Instead of plumbing and running water, it was common to have a barrel or tank of water sitting in the yard for common use, near privies and trash heaps. A contemporary official report spoke of a most offensive effluvia that was especially perceptible in warm weather. Diseases such as typhus and cholera flourished in these surroundings. The Irish entered the British economy when it was the leading industrial economy in the world, producing 1/3 of the world's manufactured goods, mining half its coal and making half its textiles. The Irish were disproportionately represented among the workmen building the railroads of Britain, though they were never a majority and seldom exceeded 30% of the workforce. In mid-19th century London, the Irish were concentrated in a few low-skill occupations. 31% of the men worked in the general labor category, and 43% of the women were domestic servants. About 20% of the London population had occupations classified as middle class, but only 4% of the Irish reached such occupational levels. As a low-paid group desperate for work, the Irish were feared as competition by English and Scottish workers in the same fields. Many fights broke out among the groups. The greatest hostility came from the Scots, who, with pick-handles at the ready, tramped across the country to beat Irishmen, burn their huts, and terrorize Irish women. Employers learned to separate their workers by nationality. Trifling episodes could set off major riots between them. While Britain shared about equally with the United States in the famine emigration from Ireland, after the 1870s, the great bulk of the Irish immigration went to America, 5 times as many people to the United States as to Great Britain in 1880, and 13 times as many in 1890. Irish immigration to Britain also declined absolutely, from about 20,000 in 1877 to about 10,000 in 1883, and never that high again through the remainder of the century. Although 1 million Irish had arrived in Britain in the 2 decades after 1840, less than 1/10 that many arrived in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In short, the passing years saw an increasingly assimilated Irish population in the British Isles. They did not disappear in a melting pot, but they became a more familiar element to the British, and vice versa. Still, as late as the 1870s, Irish neighborhoods were shunned by respectable citizens, and the police entered only in numbers. Fighting was endemic, and especially among Irishmen from different counties in Ireland. Some alehouses became segregated, patronized only by men from one county. Sometimes the fighting was between the Irish and the English, and these too could reach mob riot proportions. By the end of the 19th century, there was an established Irish community of nearly 1 million people, in a country of 30 million. They built Catholic churches and published their own newspapers, worked as laborers and street vendors, and fought in the British Army in the Crimea and southern Africa. Anti-Irish feeling was declining in the population at large, and the loyal fighting of Irish soldiers in the British Army during World War I increased their acceptance. World War II had a similar effect. By the middle of the 20th century, more than 1/5 of the Irish in Britain worked in skilled occupations. More than 30 of the Labour Party members of Parliament were Irish. Few of the Irish MPs agitate politically over the continuing Catholic-Protestant struggles in Northern Ireland. Still, they remained overrepresented among criminals and prison inmates. In Birmingham, where the Irish are 7% of the population, they constitute 60% of those arrested for drunkenness. In short, the Irish in Britain are in many ways assimilated, and yet still show historic social patterns that go back for centuries in Ireland. The United States. More than 4 million people emigrated from Ireland to the United States from 1820 to 1920. Most were the indigenous Irish Catholics, rather than the Scotch-Irish Protestants who made up most of the emigration from Ireland before that time. As in Britain, the Irish in the United States typically settled in those large port cities most readily accessible, notably Boston and New York, where cargo vessels docked. Few came on passenger ships. As in Britain, the Irish in the United States took the lowest skilled, hardest, most menial, and dangerous jobs. Many were destitute, having exhausted all their worldly possessions on the voyage. They were concentrated in one occupation, unskilled labor, more so than any other immigrant group, and many never rose any further. They lived packed into decaying, filthy slums without indoor running water or any effective means of sewage disposal. Their own ways of living added to their problems. Fighting gave Irish neighborhoods a reputation as dangerous places from New York to New Orleans to Milwaukee. This fighting extended from individual brawls to organized street gangs and terrorist organizations, such as had existed in Ireland. In some Irish neighborhoods in New York, policemen traveled only in groups of 6. Police vans became known as paddy wagons because the prisoners in them were so often Irish. The lack of cleanliness in Irish neighborhoods, including pigs rooting in the streets, promoted the spread of disease like cholera, which had been virtually unknown in the United States for generations. Alcoholism also rendered the Irish undesirable as neighbors or employees. The number of saloons in Boston rose by almost 50% in just 3 years during the influx of the Irish in the 1840s. When the Irish moved into many neighborhoods, the exodus of non-Irish residents began. In parts of 19th century New York, Negroes were preferred to the Irish as tenants. Employment advertisements, even for lowly jobs, often used the stock phrase, "No Irish need apply." More delicate advertisers would ask for a Protestant applicant, but others more bluntly said, "Any color or country except Irish." The Irish in the United States worked in many of the same kinds of occupations as in Great Britain. Irishmen built railroads and canals, mined coal, and performed many other pick-and-shovel jobs as well as factory work. They worked wherever brawn and not skill was the chief requirement. Irish women worked as domestic servants, 99% of all domestic servants in New York City in 1855. As late as 1920, 4/5 of all Irish working women were domestic servants. The Irish in mid-19th century Boston were concentrated in domestic and unskilled labor to a greater extent than blacks in Boston at the same time. Numerous attempts were made to spread the Irish out from their crowded urban slums into the rural countryside, but they remained overwhelmingly urban despite various agricultural colonies established under philanthropic auspices. What did move thousands of the Irish out of the eastern port cities was the building of railroads and canals. 3,000 Irishmen worked on the Erie Canal alone, and it was just one of many canals that linked the waterways of 19th century America. The Irish were also part of the great age of railroad building in the 19th century. So many were killed in this dangerous occupation that it was said that there was an Irishman buried under every tie. The Irish erected shanty towns along the routes of the railroads and canals they built, and many of these eventually became permanent settlements that spread the Irish out across the country. In the United States, as in Britain, politics became a major area of Irish success. A key ingredient in their political success were traits long observed in Ireland: Irish wit and adaptability, a gift for oratory, a certain vivacity, and a warm human quality that made them the best of good fellows at all times, especially in election campaigns, enabled the Irish to rise rapidly from ward heelers to city bosses and to municipal, state, and federal officials of high distinction. Graft and violence were often also part of the Irish political machines of the 19th and 20th centuries. The Irish were Democrats, with both a small and a large D. They brought with them a hatred of aristocracy, exclusiveness, or pretensions of superiority. A major factor in the success of the political machine was that it had its roots in communities of ordinary working people and was keenly aware of and responsive to their felt needs. in contrast to distant middle-class reformers to whom the masses were objects of experiment or reformation. By the late 19th century, Irish political machines dominated American cities from New York to San Francisco. Individual Irish political bosses remained in charge of their respective machines for decades. Richard J. Daley, perhaps the last of the classic machine bosses, was mayor of Chicago for more than 20 years when he died in office in 1976. Political domination meant control of a variety of municipal patronage jobs, from exalted positions like judge to lowly occupations like street cleaner that were still very attractive to those to whom any steady job was a blessing. By and large, however, Irish political success did not translate into economic advancement for the Irish masses. As late as 1890, 42% of all Irish Americans were servants, and many others were unskilled laborers. The massive inflow of Irish immigrants led to Irish control of the Roman Catholic Church in America. Even after numerous German, Polish, Italian, and other Catholic immigrants arrived, the Irish retained their dominance in the hierarchy. The Church, in turn, played a major role in the assimilation of the Irish, the promotion of education, and the discouragement of violence and drinking among them. It also discouraged the festive Irish wake and the huge funeral processions which those involved could not readily afford, and which undermined the Irish in the eyes of their fellow Americans. The growing acculturation of the Irish slowly produced tangible economic results, though the Irish remained the slowest-rising European ethnic group in the United States. Still, their head start had them generally ahead of the Jews and Italians at the beginning of the 20th century. While Irish immigrants continued to start at the bottom in manual labor occupations, the second-generation Irish were increasingly white-collar workers or occasionally professionals. The Irish were also prominent in the labor union movement. At the beginning of the 20th century, 50 out of 110 presidents of the AFL unions were of Irish ancestry. They were seldom businessmen, however, again a pattern going back to Ireland. With the passing years, the American-born Irish began to outnumber the Irish immigrants. By 1920, native-born Irish Americans outnumbered immigrants from Ireland by more than 3 to 1. Today, Irish Americans of the first and second generation combined are outnumbered by Irish Americans of older vintage by 10 to 1. Irish Americans today have equaled or exceeded the American national average in income and IQ, and their family size and voting patterns are very similar to those of other Americans. Historically, it represents one of the great social transformations of a people.